Monsieur le maire, Madame le conseiller Fatema,
Mr. Mayor, councillors, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to be able here with you today. I am most happy because actually my university can be considered the most Polish university in France, because it was actually re-established by Stanislas Leszczynski, King of Poland, who later became the Duke of Lorraine. I am delighted to be able to meet colleagues and politicians who are taking up this huge new challenge that faces all of us. Kraków is a very special, innovative city. Thank you very much for making it possible for me to speak to you here. Parsimony, one of the virtues that I'd like to draw your attention to, very important from my perspective. This is also related to my thoughts. Madame Obey, who actually made it possible in our country to pass new legislation on electromagnetic fields. The subject matter I'm going to discuss is fairly technical, somewhat difficult. At the same time, I'm going to speak from my perspective, French perspective, presenting French legislation. I'm going to also discuss the current legislative solutions that are being prepared at the moment. I try to be as clear as possible, trying to refer to the different slides that have been prepared for this presentation. Before I start discussing the very subject matter I have prepared for today, before I discuss the mobile phones and base stations, I would like to make a few general comments. Can I share with you at the very beginning some of my thoughts, some of my ideas? And I stress this is a French perspective and a perspective of a lawyer. I will try to present to you what my legal approach is. We have a number of different studies, results of possible effects of electromagnetic fields on nature. There are studies that focused on birds, on storks. Balmori publication from 2005, possible effects of electromagnetic fields from phone mast on a population of white stork. There are other studies focusing on the impact of electromagnetic fields on the population of bees. There are other studies, impact on human health. So again, the legal perspective, risk, and the harm that is caused by electromagnetic fields. So we have a number of studies that have been conducted so far, focusing on the possible harm, especially here I stress the human beings, also fetus, very serious threat. The next issue is related to what is called radio stations or base stations. As you are well aware, there are a number of elements to them. First of all, a building, or a mast or a construction. Very often they are placed at the top of residential buildings where the so-called active devices are placed, the very equipment that is used for transmitting signals. There are a number of different controversies here. There are some who believe that the people who live in the buildings where such base stations were erected, that they are as if protected by what can be compared to an umbrella-like radiation. But it's only partly true. We need to remember that there are a number of different phenomena where people who live just under the base station, apparently they live as if under an umbrella. But then the radiation can be deflected from other buildings. As you can see here in this slide, the metal parts of the buildings deflect radiation. You have to be aware of that. Then the next slide, a very important issue related to our French legislation. President Chirac actually wrote into our French constitution the so-called precautionary principle. It is one of the achievements of President Mitterrand, I admit. There is another principle related to prevention. When we speak about prevention, it's about a certain outcome that can be easily predicted. But as for the precautionary principle, there are a number of risks where even at the current level of the development of science, it is difficult to predict what the impact of certain phenomena is going to be on human health or the environment. It is an extremely important principle. It's a principle that has been enshrined in the French constitution. It's the very top of our hierarchy of legal norms. This principle has what I call a vertical impact on the legislation, but also at the same time, in the case of the Court of Cassation, it has an impact of what I call horizontal impact. So a private French individual that decides to take another private individual to court may always call upon this precautionary principle. This is very important in the very subject matter we are discussing here. Now, yet another introductory comment I would like to make here, the one that makes it possible to understand our subject matter, is the difference between results of scientific research, scientific evidence, and legal evidence. Scientific research is usually long-term, with very long-term results. It requires search for absolute truth that may require 20, 30, or sometimes 100 or 150 years until something is discovered. Now, as for legal evidence, the term evidence is understood here differently. This is evidence as of now, the evidence that can be called upon, the one that may be considered by the two sides of legal disputes. Can I also make something more precise? Because actually the first debate on the subject we are discussing is related to what evidence needs to prove. Do we need to prove actually that radiation is harmful, or the opposite approach? Is there a need to actually prove that they are not harmful? It all depends, of course, on the context in which we operate and the way in which we approach this precautionary principle. There are other issues that have to be considered. The burden of proof. Here, again, we can ask the following question. Who is responsible for actually providing us with the burden of proof? Those who perhaps are hurt, harmed by radiation? On the other side, should the burden of proof be on the side of those who develop new technologies and want to promote their use? I move on to the next issue I would like to discuss with you. It is about the role of different regulators and different administrations at different levels. At the local level, the person responsible for regulation is the mayor in France plays a very important role, especially because it's the mayors who issue decisions when applications are made for new constructions. Then, at the national level, there are additional important organs responsible for the area. On the one hand, we've got Agence Nationale de Fréquences, National Agency for Frequencies, that plays a very important role. ANFR, as it is called in France. It is responsible for a number of areas in relation to electromagnetic fields. It is responsible for the division of the spectrum to different operators. It coordinates the program of construction of radio stations in the territory of the country and plays a role also in the context of human health. And now the next institution, the RRCEP, Autorité de Régulation des Communications Électroniques et des Postes, yet another regulator of the electronic communication and postal services. It plays a number of roles, has a number of roles as well. It's a legal act, Abbey, from 2015. The next point is about certain thresholds for possible radiation and their impact on human health. Here, originally in the year 2002, the so-called Decree 775 from the 3rd of May 2002 was passed by the Council of Ministers. It is about those maximum levels of electromagnetic fields. It was passed still before this precautionary principle I mentioned in the earlier slides. This decree is still in force. Then, thanks to our legislation 136 from 2015, we've got the so-called soft law approach. This act from 2015, number 135, it encourages to taking measurements, local measurements of radiation, and lists a number of non-typical points where very high values have been measured. I am convinced that this is going to be a very useful tool for all of us. The reason is that now it is possible for us to reach away from the thresholds that might be perhaps subjects of never-ending discussions of experts. Let me move on now to the 3 points I would like to present to you. First, I'm going to give you some information that has to be collected before construction starts, installation is made, and the principle that has to ensure the correct implementation of legislation. Then I'm going to speak about the different controls that has to be done before construction is started, and then the different ways, legal ways, that are maybe used by local residents after actually the construction is finished. So now as for the first area, as for those who have to first make information available is the mobile telephony operator. The company is required to provide some basic information. So first of all, it has to inform the owners or co-owners of a building. It has to provide them with minimum list of information. Also to provide information to residents of the building and residents living in the neighborhood. And the information has to be made available, and notice has to be made available to everyone living in the given neighborhood. Since the Abbey legislation came into force, the operators who look for a location for a new base station are also obliged to inform the local mayor 2 months actually before the notice I mentioned earlier is issued. So the process of search for a location has to be notified to the local mayor. So the mayor in France, as you can see, is a very well-informed person. And then, as the mayor has been informed already, then the mayor actually is obliged to organize a meeting at which some initial discussions are held and initial documents can be made available. Before this new legislation entered force, the mayors often had very limited information on the base station and the operations of local operators. The mayors had usually just some basic information, like the document that would make construction possible. So the mayors would know that there would be masts, for instance, 15 meters high, but the mayors before the Abbey legislation did not know exactly how many different elements would be used there, what the power is going to be of the different devices that would be installed there. As it is now, if the mayor asks for additional information, such information has to be made available to him or her, and further steps can be taken as a result on the basis of this information. So that's it regarding the information that is made available before the construction of the base station. I realize my time is limited, so I'm going to move on to the second part now, the different checks and controls that are made after the information is passed on to local residents. The French administration law draws a difference between what they call the order, police, as it is called in France, the competences, on the other hand. There is a special urban order that is controlled by the mayors, and a special order with relation to the frequencies that are used by the operators that depends again here on the central decisions of the central French administration. Can I speak now about the urban planning now and the urban order first?
Lorsque l'on parle de construire,
so a few specifics. When we're talking about the foundation of a base station, we are either talking of building the mast or of founding the base station on an existing building. And we might be talking, why not, about changes made to an existing base station, meaning raising its power. And we should also take into account other technical components. For example, the equipment that ensures safety when you're accessing the roof terraces, because you need a lifeline, you need protection barriers, you need handrails, so that the specialists who are working on those areas wouldn't fall off the building. And so in the future, it will also be necessary to take into account the fact that equipment will be miniaturized. It will be becoming smaller and smaller. Will be becoming smaller and smaller. And after this has been explained, I need to present what are the main principles of the urban planning law. So the first principle is that new structures, even those that are not founded on foundations, still require a building permit to be issued. This building permit is a requirement. So operators were trying to bypass this requirement. How did they do that? Firstly, they would slice the project. They would split the structure into components. So they would split it into the concrete elements, the reinforcement elements, the load-bearing structure maybe, and the French Supreme Administrative Court has said we must be talking of the entirety of the device. There is another problem, which is the installation of base stations on existing buildings. So, which principle can the mayor control compliance with? Under the rules of the spatial development, of course, I think that in France and in Poland, we are talking about the local spatial development plan, which specifies, for example, what is the maximum height of buildings that can be erected on a given area, and you cannot erect a base station on a building which is already too high. On top of that, we've got green areas. Those green areas are also specified where they are in that local spatial development plan. There are also rules for the protection and valorization of protected landscape, Natura 2000 areas, national parks and other protected areas. So certain installations, certain projects have to be disassembled and removed because they violated the principles of protecting protected landscape areas. And what is most important is the public health issues. This item is the subject of very many discussions because it is on the interface of urban order, urban planning order, and the frequency order or rules. But since the mayor is responsible for public health, he must or she must also comply with the precautionary principle. This seems to be logical. In order to be able to control, the mayor must have sufficient information. And just as I have said before, the Abbey law has introduced a lot here. It has made a great contribution. Let me now move on to the order with regard to frequencies, or the regulation of frequencies. I will not be analyzing the slide in great detail because this is very technical. I just wanted to say that the Council of State has taken a decision, and therefore it is only the state that can regulate frequencies, and the state is to properly manage the resource of radio frequencies, or electromagnetic frequencies, and this to some extent limits the authority of the mayor. But I will also say something positive, and I want to emphasize what is called the cadastral register of base stations. There is a map similar to Google Map, and it has been developed for the entire territory of France, for all the cities and towns. This is my town, and the red spot on it happens to be my office. I am located in a place where several hundred meters away from me there are very many base stations, and every square represents one such station, and every color represents one operator. When you click on that spot, you can see what measurements have been taken. I do believe that this is a very interesting instrument because it contributes a lot to the transparency of public life. With regard to the order or regulation of frequencies, what are the measures taken or available to protect the public health of residents? Definitely they are not the values from the decree, because those values are obsolete. They are not suitable for our times. That decree comes from the year 2002, and as I have said, those values are obsolete. The protection is based on looking for non-typical or unusual places, and it is quite likely that this threshold will be lower and lower. So far it's 6 volts per meter, but our aim is to reduce this exposure threshold. In the old decree, which I am criticizing very vocally, well, it does, however, have some good aspects. For example, there is the requirement that schools, crashes, healthcare institutions must be protected. We can only feel sorry that this decree still hasn't been put into effect, because I know schools in Paris that have base stations on their roofs, and I believe that is a clear violation of the provisions of this decree. I also want to say quickly what control is done after the base station has been installed. Because there is the administrative control, but there are limits to it. There is also court control, judicial control, and this one gives us hope for very many things. I am a professor of private law. Of course, I prefer courts of general jurisdiction and not administrative courts. I think you can understand me. If we're talking about the control by the administrative courts, this requires measurements of the electromagnetic fields. In order to control anything, you have to measure it. Well, we don't have the time for me to go into details of this, but there is the whole problem of the measurement protocol. What this is about is that you have to determine who is to do that. Is it the city? Are they market operators who will always be paid for by the same client, that is by the operators, mobile operators themselves? And in terms of independence, that will always be a problem, because the measurement institution would always be paid by the mobile operators, and this leads to a very clear conflict of interest. Once the antenna has already been installed, there is not that much we can do. Undoubtedly, the code does call for sanctions, administrative sanctions, or penalties, but these sanctions do not apply to excesses over permissible values. They are only about interference that makes it impossible for other transmissions to be made. Why? Because the administrative court control is very weak once the base station has been installed. So, at the end, what can the Court of General Jurisdiction say? Well, the Court of General Jurisdiction can do a lot.
une activité très récente, qui n'a rien à voir avec les
And please give me a minute of your attention because I want to say something about a case that has happened that has nothing to do with electromagnetic waves. But in France, there is a huge controversy about selling phytosanitary products that kill bees. So pesticides that are harmful to bees. The national agency has allowed them to be marketed, and there is an association, Génération Future, the future generation, has filed a case with the Court of General Jurisdiction, and almost immediately had the permit withdrawn. This permit has been withdrawn temporarily, but it can show you that the Courts of General Jurisdiction can play a very major role here. And now, who could get damages? Damages can be given for noise, because base stations frequently creak and, let's say, whisper. They make noises. They can make those saturation noises. I've seen a base station that was creaking and whispering. In addition, the foundation of a base station causes the building to lose some value, because and the apartment in the building, because the building will get sold for a lower price if it's close to a base station. So there is economic harm. For patients of Professor Belpom, there is an important issue of having protective measures installed, the cost of installing filters and the like. Even if we're talking about the co-ownership or joint ownership, there are interesting cases where one of the joint owners has applied for the base of the calculation of the costs that the co-owners have to pay should be recalculated, because his terrace was too close to the base station and he could not use his terrace. On top of that, there are damages for fear, for anxiety, and courts will grant such damages because such damages were applied in the case of asbestos. So we are now reaching the conclusion. So what is the French model? Because a French person could only talk of a French model. So this is a very good model, but there is something to be improved. It's a very good model, but we want to have stronger information for the mayor. It's a good model in terms of protecting children, especially at schools, at creches. And let me turn to the mayor here. This is about the active role of certain municipalities in the soft law concerning the installation of base stations. So this, of course, is a model that should be improved, because there is nothing perfect in this world. So this is about having ex-ante information that should be more easily available to the residents. The residents encountered great difficulty trying to learn or find out that a base station will be installed with a certain antenna and what characteristics it will have, because you have to be an expert for that. Another problem is that primary schools are protected from, for example, Wi-Fi, but they are not properly protected from emissions from base station antennas. so far, the mayors did not have the necessary technical information about this. This is now changing, but my dear friends, those were some elements, some reflections that I wanted to share with you. So I want to thank you very much for inviting me here and also for hosting me here.